So today we're pressing Judge Sauvignon Blanc from Bennett Valley. We just loaded it into the press. And in terms of mechanics of this press, like a lot of them, it's a bladder press. So if you imagine we've got this stainless steel drum here, the portion you can see that upright is pure stainless. It doesn't have any slats in it. And that's the side that has basically a plastic bladder on that portion. The other half of the drum, the part that's not exposed to us right now, has slits cut all the way through it. And when we load grapes in, they go into the door, we close the door, and then we have a program built that tells that bladder, the plastic bag inside, to inflate and deflate at certain pressures. So as we load it, we start out with really low pressure in that bag. It rotates the screens upside down and inflates the bag really gently, so we get a really gentle press. And then as the press cycle goes on, we'll press harder and harder with that bag into a program we already have pre-programmed into the press. And then once you're about halfway through, you start turning as well. You can imagine if you got that cake in there of grapes, initially as you press, you start to get out the stuff that's really easily extracted, which is the good juice. It's what you want. As you press harder and harder, you would expect to see, for most sites, the pH start to rise, because again, just like foot trotting, you're starting to extract more and more potassium. There are some sites where if you have a lot of raisins in there, either through sun exposure, premature shrivel, botrytis would be another one. As you press harder and harder, you would actually expect to see the bricks go up. That's kind of unusual. There's other sites where if you had a lot of greenberry, you would actually expect to see the pH drop as you press, which is also pretty unusual. So that's something we're watching for as we go through the press cycle. We'll measure the bricks and we'll measure the pH and just kind of keep an eye on it. And at some point, as we go through this and increase our bar of pressure and increase the number of turns we're using, we're going to make a press cut. Once we feel like we have the quality we want, trying to balance economical yield, acidity, flavor, and bricks, once we feel like we have the final cuvee of that, we'll make a cut, and everything beyond that will go to a different tank for what we call the press. And that cut may or may not make the final wine. It usually doesn't. You can always expect that wine is a lot bigger shouldered, it has more aromatics. You kind of see the effect of what you otherwise would have gotten if you'd done a longer skin soak time. And that'll get fermented separately and typically put elsewhere rather than in the finished wine. This is the press cycle I've got built that we use for Riesling and stuff that's precious. And basically you can see we've got steps here and pressure. So what we're on right now is the 2/10 bar of pressure, which goes for 280 seconds. The bag will deflate just a little bit. And then it increases in pressure, and we don't have a turn built in until the 5th step. And at that point, it'll turn once, reset the whole cake, and go back to doing low pressure. So we would expect the Judge Sauvignon Blanc portion of this press load to come somewhere from the first 10 to 15 press cuts, something like that, depending on where we see the acidity going, the flavor, texture, the bricks, stuff like that. And now we are sampling the juice from Judge Sauvignon Blanc. We've got a refractometer that we use to measure the density of the wine or the sweetness. It's got a little beam of light that shines it through the juice and tells me what we're at. We're at 23.6, which is about right. That's what we sampled at. And that predicts our finished ethanol, body, all sorts of stuff. In terms of flavor, very green. Judge is a unique site. It's a really cold spot within Bennett Valley. It comes in late. It gives a lot of tropical notes, usually really distinctive like red apple skin on the nose. And as we taste and the press cycle goes on, we're looking to see sort of how that balance in the mouth changes, if we're seeing more or less green acidity, how the flavors are changing, if they're getting coarser or finer, if the bricks are rising or falling, stuff like that. Just keep an eye on the juice, and I'm going to go measure the pH on this as well. And both of those will help us to make our press cut when the time comes. So for Bedrock, for all the barrel ferments, we do what's called brown juice pressing. And the idea is to expose the wine to oxygen early in its life as juice and oxidize all the phenols and stuff like that that would otherwise oxidize in bottle down the line, and try and drop that all out early rather than having that pre-mox in bottle is kind of the thought. You can see the stuff I just pulled is pretty light in color. It looks like you'd expect to see apple juice or grape juice, something like that. But if I go into the pan here, and this pan has only been sitting here probably 5 minutes, we've got brown juice. And that's very intentional for us. If it's going to go down to barrel, we're not going to use CO2 in the press pan to expose it to oxygen early, and then again a second time as we rack down the barrel, just to get all that stuff to oxidize early, drop out, and then once it starts to ferment, we'll actually be left with a clean, crystal clear, star bright wine, which is really crazy but cool.